Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament Gospels. We're studying the life of Christ here, and we're looking at about 250 events that happened that were recorded in the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're looking at them chronologically and going through them. And today we come apart, and it's a small section of Luke. It's Luke's 8 verses 1 through 3, where Luke specifically calls out women who accompanied Jesus or helped Jesus with his ministry. And so this is really important. One of the things we talked about at the very beginning of when we started this and we looked at Luke, Luke makes sure to show and show special attention to the fact that Jesus showed special attention to women in the fact that he brought them along. He was very gracious to them. He showed a lot of grace. You know, we see that with the woman at the well. We're going to see that with the woman caught in adultery. And so this shows that Luke shows that Jesus or that women were involved in Jesus's ministry, and it wasn't limited to the doing simple tasks and things like that sometimes we see in the church. And so we'll look at Luke 8 verses 1 through 3, and then I got a couple points and then this one isn't going to be a real long one, but this is a very important one, and I hope that makes sense because and the reason I say that is because in the church today, and or I say in the church, many times we have pushed women's roles, and because of a couple verses that are taken out of context, we have shoved women's roles into, oh well, you can work in the kitchen and you can take care of the children, and that's about all you can do. And we see that that wasn't the case in Jesus' ministry, and we need to make sure we point that out and correct that error that's been taught and tradition that's been passed down in many ways in the church. And so we need to look at that. So we start in verse 1 of Luke 8, and it says, soon afterwards Jesus began a tour of the nearby towns and villages, preaching and announcing the good news about the kingdom of God. He took his 12 disciples with him, right? And Luke could have stopped here. He didn't need to go any further. In fact, most people writing in this day would have stopped there. They wouldn't have mentioned women because women were not considered important. Women couldn't be eyewitnesses. Women, there was a lot of things. Literally, women were considered property. So most people writing would not have included about all these women that were following Jesus. But he says in verse 2, along with some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, so people that Jesus had brought along with him that he had cured, among them were Mary Magdalene, right, whom he cast out 7 demons, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, Susanna, and many others who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples. And so this is there. Luke makes sure to add this or add them, include them into this list of those who were helping Jesus because it was important to understand what the role that Jesus was allowing women to take in his ministry, because it would not have been allowed. Women back in that day, and we're going to look at this, right? Jesus lifted women up, right, from servitude and from, really degradation to, the joy of fellowship and service. And that's where we've got to make sure that we don't get caught up in what the Pharisaic world and the world that they grew up in, where women were considered property. And Jesus lifted them up out of that, right? And we see that in his ministry, and we see that in the New Testament. And if you truly study, right, and we're going to do this, if you truly study the women that were involved in Paul's ministry, and helped with the church, we see a lot of women mentioned in Acts and stuff like that. They were doing more than just sitting on the sidelines or helping make some bread or making meals and doing things like that. They were actively involved in teaching in the ministry of Christ and the apostles. And so we're going to continue to see that. In Jewish culture, right, women were not allowed to learn from rabbis. And Jesus would have been considered a rabbi in this time, a teacher. And by allowing these women to travel with him, Jesus was showing that all people are equal under God. He was saying, look, they can travel with me, they can learn, they can, they more than likely, we one of the things we talk about is the hidden women in the Bible sometimes, and we see in the New Testament where it talks about he sent out his disciples, right? Well, a lot of times we just assume that they were all men, but no, he sent them out 2 by 2. So the people that he would have sent out would have included women to spread his message, to teach about who he was. And so we need to make sure we don't forget that and miss that when we're and just assume that every single person that was following Jesus was male. That's not the case. He had 100 or more disciples, 100 plus disciples, and many of them were women. And so these women also, right? They supported ministry with their own money. They were Jesus' ministry with they're using Jesus's or their money to help support Jesus. They owed a great debt to him because he had driven out demons out of some, he'd healed others, and so they were there to heal them. And the other thing I want to point out, and I didn't put this in the notes of our reading, but the other thing I want to point out is there's several things we need to pay attention to, and I'll call them out as we go through them. But you look throughout the New Testament, the very first person that Jesus admitted that he was Christ to, besides John the Baptist, right? When Jesus started his ministry, was a woman at the well. She was the very first person to preach Jesus to an entire town. Right? If we go and look, we see this where all these women were supporting Jesus and they were part of Jesus's ministry. If we go and look to the first people to declare or preach the fact or teach the fact or declare that Jesus had risen from the dead were women. Right? The men didn't believe him, so they had to go and check. And so we need to make sure, and we're going to do a study on this, but we need to make sure we do not limit women's roles to simply being, oh, well, you can, I have heard it preached. Well, we allow our women to serve in the kitchen and teach the children. That is not the biblical role for women in the church, right? Now, there are biblical roles for men and women. There are things that we are asked to be over. There's areas that men are asked to lead in, and there's areas that men and women are asked to lead in, right? But what we've got to do is get away from taking basically two verses in the Bible and using those two verses, taking them out of context, and then using them to say, well, women really can't really do a lot in the church, or they can do a lot of behind the scenes work, but they really can't, because one, we're taking the idea of church completely out of context, because the way they had church and the way they did church is completely different than the way we do it today. So that context doesn't apply anymore. And secondly, it was not about, oh, well, the men are up here and the women are under here and the men have to do what the women say, right? And that's not what it was about either. And so we've got this really messed up idea of what the roles of the male and female in the church are supposed to be, when they're supposed to be tied together, working side by side, working together. We've made it look like this. And that's not what Jesus intended. That's not what he asked for us to do. It wasn't about, oh, well, these men need to be in charge and need to tell everyone what to do, and then and the women are over here, so have these different steps. That's not what Jesus was looking for. And that's not what he was looking for in a church. It was a side by side relationship where we were to work together, and we see that. We see that. And again, I'm not saying there's not certain roles that we need to look at, and we're going to look at those, but the way we have done it in the church in a lot of ways is not biblical. It's not biblical, and we need to stop doing it. In fact, the idea of authority and leadership in the church, that's not really biblical either, because the idea of that was to be a servant in the church. You are to be at the bottom, right? And too many people, and too many of our roles, our pastors and our elders and even our deacon positions, we have moved up to be some sort of leadership, high authority type position, when it was supposed to be the opposite. It was supposed to be a leadership, or I'm sorry, a servantship, a shepherd, someone who serves people, and it's not someone who just lords over people, right? And so we need to make sure we are getting that right. And we're going to take a deeper look into this. And I know I'm hitting a lot of things, and it's not really has to do with women, but I'm still hitting on it for a reason, because all this is going to tie together. All this is going to tie together, and we're going to see that, all these positions of authority that in a church weren't really positions of authority. They were positions of servanthood, where they were to be servants. They were to put themselves last, absolutely last, and serve the spiritual needs of the church. And now it's more of a business leader who oversees the business of the church and really doesn't pay much attention to the soul or the spiritual nature of the church. And so that's something that we're going to dive into and look at as we go on. And I know that got off the topic of the women that were serving Jesus, but again, it all ties back to each other. And so I want to make sure I connect those as we go through. So the important thing to look at in this message is that women were heavily involved in the role and in the ministry of Jesus, from supporting it to teaching to spreading his word. They did all these things. And so we need to make sure that we don't forget that when we read that, and we don't just casually go over this and use things that we've been taught, right? Just casually breeze over it miss it and miss what's happening here, right? Because this was a huge thing back in this day. This was huge because it wasn't allowed. And Jesus comes in and says, yeah, it is. They can follow me. They can be involved in my ministry, and they can learn, and then they can spread my word, right? And teach about my kingdom. And he made sure that can happen. Again, I appreciate everyone who sticks around and watches these videos. I appreciate you for sharing them. If you think this is something that could be beneficial for in others, please share it. As always, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do so. We're going to continue to do studies like this, and we're going to dive into even more deeper studies in some of these subjects that, we hit on as we come along through, but we're going to dive even deeper into them as we go along. And as always, I appreciate everyone for watching.